This is the revision video for B2 Feeding Relationships. What do food chains show us? A food chain shows us what organisms eat. It shows the flow of food and energy from one organism to the next. The arrows show the direction of flow of energy from one organism to the next. In the example, the zebra eats the grass and the arrow shows us that the energy flows from the grass to the zebra. The lion then eats the zebra and the energy flows from the zebra to the lion. Each link in the food chain is a separate feeding level called a trophic level. The first trophic level in the food chain is always a producer. These are organisms such as plants that make their own food. The rest of the organisms in a food chain are consumers. Consumers eat other organisms because they cannot make their own food. The second trophic level is the primary consumer. Primary consumers are animals that eat plants. Another name for these animals is herbivores. The third link in the food chain are secondary consumers, meaning the second consumer in the food chain. These are animals that eat other animals. We call animals that eat other animals carnivores. Food chains don't usually have more than 4 or 5 organisms because after this stage there isn't enough energy left to pass on. The fourth link in the food chain is the tertiary consumer, meaning the third consumer in the food chain. If this is the last link in the food chain, then it is also known as the top predator or top carnivore. This diagram shows us the different links in a food chain and how this relates to the trophic levels. So again, we see that trophic level 1, or T1, is always a producer. T2 is a primary consumer, and so on. Food chains show animals eating only one food source, but in reality, almost all animals eat a wide variety of other organisms. This means that the same animal would appear in many different food chains. We can link food chains within a habitat together to make a food web to show us all the different feeding relationships within a certain environment. Here we can see that the grass from the previous food chain is not only eaten by the zebra but also by the gazelle, and that the lion eats the gazelle as well as the zebra. When biologists study habitats and feeding relationships, it can be useful to study how many organisms there are at each level in a food chain. How many grass plants are needed to feed a herd of zebra? And how many lions would a herd of zebra feed? One lion would need quite a few zebra to feed it, and those zebra would need even more grass to feed them. When we look at the numbers of organisms at each stage, we usually see something like this, with large numbers of organisms at trophic level 1 and then the numbers decreasing as we move through the food chain. This is called a pyramid of numbers, as it shows us the number of organisms at each trophic level, and it is usually pyramid shaped. Here is another example of a food chain, and the pyramid of numbers for this food chain. But not all pyramids of numbers are pyramid shaped. Sometimes the pyramid has a strange shape. For example, there may be one very large producer that feeds a lot of smaller consumers. The food chain shown here is an example of this. The large tree can feed lots of impala, and so the pyramid of numbers would look like this. What is biomass? Biomass is the dry mass of an organism. Rather than thinking about the number of organisms at each level in a food chain, we can instead look at the biomass and plot a pyramid of biomass. Pyramids of biomass are always pyramid shaped. As you can see in this example, the pyramid of numbers was not pyramid shaped because there was one large tree at the bottom. However, because of the mass of that tree, the bar for the pyramid of biomass becomes much larger at the bottom. There is always less biomass at each stage as we go through the food chain, but why? It is because energy is lost at each stage in the food chain. But where does the energy that is lost go? If we think about the horse in this example, not all the energy from the food that it eats is available to pass on to whatever eats the horse. That is because energy is used and lost. Some energy is lost as heat from respiration, some biomass is lost in feces and urine, and some energy is used for movement and growth. Only a small amount of the biomass that the horse eats is actually used to make new horse and is available to be passed on. When we look at these energy losses throughout the entire food chain, we can see that only a very small amount of energy from the sun is utilised and passed along the food chain. Of the energy from the sun that hits the producer, only 1% of this is absorbed by the plant and used in photosynthesis. And only 0.1% of this energy from the sun is available to the fox at the end of the food chain. This is why food chains do not usually have more than 4 or 5 organisms, because the amount of energy left in the food chain by this point is so small. Energy losses in the food chain is something that needs to be considered by farmers. Modern farming needs to produce food as cost effectively as possible, which means that farmers need to minimise energy losses from the food chain to get the best yield. Less energy is transferred out from animals if they use less heat to keep themselves warm. So in intensive farming, animals are kept indoors to keep them warm. Another reason for keeping them inside and in cages is to reduce how much they can move. By reducing their movement, it reduces the amount of energy that they use.